Well, welcome back. And I just want to again give a shout out to our keynote speaker, Manju Kulkarni, for joining us today. She came to our in-person conference on April 22nd and made a big splash for the conference that day. And we're so glad she's back at this virtual conference and being our, another great highlight for the day. So the theme, again, for this year's conference is connecting our truth. And the two objectives that we want to achieve today are that you will be able to share and examine your origin story and understand how your story can lead to increased solidarity and advocacy for greater well-being. We also want to ask you to reflect on your origin stories together and explore how storytelling and personal identities can fuel movements toward holistic health and collective liberation. Those are two, really big ideas, and we know that we'll just begin to touch on them today. But we hope that through the keynote that message that you'll hear from Manju, as well as the discussions that we'll have, we will arrive at meeting those two objectives. So just a little intro for Manju Kulkarni. So she is Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance. And this organization serves and represents the 1.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. And in March 2020, Manju co-founded the Stop AAPI Hate, the nation's leading aggregator of COVID-19 related hate incidents against AAPIs. And Manju, along with a couple of her colleagues, they were named as one of Time's 100 most influential people of 2021. And if you want to see Manju, in person, she's actually coming back to Portland end of this month. She'll be speaking to the Trailblazers staff and will be delivering a similar presentation that you will be hearing today. So without further ado, we are going to hear from Manju Kulkarni.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thank you for the invitation to join again. I had such a wonderful time in Portland in April and just really enjoyed our full day together. So it's an honor to be with you all, albeit virtually. So I'm going to do two presentations in one. And I'll start off with talking a little bit about my work and my origin story, and then take you through what is our shared history as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And hopefully everyone can see that. And this is in fact the same presentation that I did when I was in Portland. So meeting the moment, origins to activism. So I want to start off by sharing with you what are, very unfortunate incidents that have happened. These, like many, many others we've received at Stop AAPI Hate, give you an idea of the type of hate incidents reported to us. You can read them for yourself. The top example is one of workplace discrimination. The one in the middle is physical assault. At the bottom is one of verbal harassment toward elderly grandparents. And then the one on the right is of a middle school child who was physically attacked and verbally assaulted on the schoolyard here in Los Angeles. Another child approached him, said, "You're a COVID carrier, go back to China." And when he responded that he was not Chinese, He was punched in the face and head 20 times. So we began immediately working with the family and then also working with local officials to hold a press conference to say that this type of behavior would not be tolerated in our city and county. I was approached by Russell Jung and Cynthia Che, who are up in the Bay Area and seeing similar type of incidents. So we co-founded Stop AAPI Hate. It's a coalition organization. And now, as Helen has said, we're the nation's leading aggregator of anti-Asian Pacific Islander hate. In 21 months, we've received almost 11,000 incident reports from all 50 states in the District of Columbia. Unfortunately, women have made up a bulk of individuals who've reported to us at 62%, also youth at 10% and seniors at 7%. So we know vulnerable populations are being targeted. And then we also know that these are happening in public streets, public parks, and in businesses. The most common type of harassment, or sorry, discrimination is verbal harassment, followed by physical assaults, which are still a relatively low number, 16%, avoidance and shunning. And then we have the civil rights violations, workplace discrimination, refusal of service, being barred from transit or transportation in a ride hailing service. Let me say and make this very clear, you may have heard the term hate crimes. Very, very few of these are hate crimes. Vast majority, close to 90%, are not even crimes at all. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take them seriously, but it signals to us what the right solutions are, right? We can't simply rely on law enforcement because 90% of them don't involve law enforcement, right? So I want you to be aware of that. When you hear people use the term hate crimes, please correct them and let them know that the number of hate crimes actually in the top 10 cities in America per city is just in the single digits, only about, under 10 per city. Most incidents, as I said, take place in the public, and you can see all of those places. Note specifically schools and universities. We think that number is a little bit low, but we know that, in the last academic year, schools were, in most parts of the country, all virtual. Universities had only remote learning. So that's why we think that number's low. You see also, sadly, that 1% take place in the health sector. So that means even during the pandemic, people are experiencing discrimination where they are getting health care. You see from this slide that it's affecting all parts of our community. A plurality are Chinese Americans, but we also see other East Asians impacted, Korean as well as Japanese, Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Filipino, Filipinx, even individuals who identify as biracial and white, in addition to an Asian ethnicity. We also have South Asian and Indian specifically, and even Pacific Islanders are experiencing hate. So what are the key takeaways? That racial discrimination affects all of our communities. Intersectionality does matter, and that's why we're seeing, of course, that women, unfortunately, are being targeted with sexualized harassment as well as racial or racist harassment. As I said, most of these incidents are not crimes and therefore not hate crimes. So a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. There is not a single profile of perpetrators. And contrary to what you may have seen on social media or even in mainstream media, African Americans do not make up a majority of those who've caused the harm. In fact, a couple of university professors have studied this specifically. So it is not African Americans. And then lastly, this is not just about interpersonal attacks, but also structural decisions and institutional racism. What you see here, when we talk about race and Asian Americans, it's important to sort of keep in mind kind of where we fall vis-a-vis other populations. There's something known as the racial ladder. When we think of sort of how race works in America, unfortunately, with white supremacy, whiteness is really on top in the racial ladder and Blackness at the bottom. And so many times for immigrant communities, our parents, grandparents, they've sought what's called white adjacency. So what that means is, essentially seeking out ways in which, individuals can access resources, live in the suburbs, send their kids to good schools, have a house with a dog and a pool. All of those things are, mostly in our society limited in terms of access to white individuals. We know because of redlining, African Americans have been really segregated out of some of those neighborhoods, some of the best schools, etc. Now, when we think of where AAPIs land, we see that the outsider status connotes to perpetual foreignness. What does that mean? So you may have gotten a question that's, oh, where are you from? Where are you really from? And just simply because of how you look, people think you're not American, and they don't assign being American with looking like us. It's just those individuals who have, blonde hair and blue eyes, or brown hair and white skin, or whatever it might be. Even those who look African American or even Latinx. And this is particularly dangerous when we think about COVID and how we've been blamed for the disease. It's because of the perpetual foreignness. We know that actually the COVID strand that first came to the United States was from Italy, and yet you've never heard Italian Americans or whites being blamed for COVID. And then when you look at the insider status, there's the term model minority, which has been used and bandied about. And unfortunately, a lot of Asian Americans have used it as sort of a badge of honor. And unfortunately, if you know the origins, you know that you shouldn't hold it as a badge of honor. Professor William Peterson from University of California at Berkeley coined the term in 1966. Think about what was happening in America in 1966. It was the height of the civil rights movement. And even yet in that time, he said, he juxtaposed Black Americans against Japanese specifically. And he said, oh, look how well Japanese Americans are doing socioeconomically, and African Americans or Blacks don't do well. Of course, he was ignoring the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, even, continued discrimination against Blacks that Japanese Americans didn't face. And number two, he said that African Americans were a problem because they challenged essentially secondary status. He said they were complaining when they demanded civil rights and they demanded resources like the Great Society programs. And Japanese Americans, he said, look at them, they're a model because they didn't complain about Japanese American incarceration. And you'll note, by the way, I don't use the term internment. That is, internment camp is really a euphemism, and to me, that's actually pretty obscene. Camps are where you get to go swimming and play baseball and do fun things. Camps are not where you're held against your will. And so anyway, he was of course wrong about that because Japanese Americans did challenge their incarceration. And number two, because, it seeks to, create a wedge vis-a-vis African Americans. And it's really been used to silence us so that we can't challenge the injustices that we experience. So we're really trying to debunk that myth of the model minority. If you look at income inequality in our communities, some communities who've come as refugees and asylees have very low income. Those who've come from, the tech background or medicine, they tend to do well, really because of some of the privileges they've had in the homeland. And of course, we know a lot of the refugees and asylees in Asia came because of American imperialism and the bombing of their homes and their communities by the American government. We also know that it's a myth because we've experienced high rates of small business closure and unemployment. So really, it's high time that we debunk that myth. And we know too from the mental health challenges that our communities experience, especially now, 20% have reported experiencing racial trauma because of the racism. 72% said, in fact, it was discrimination and not even COVID that was their greatest source of stress. On the good, positive side, 28% said simply reporting to Stop AAPI Hate, they felt a reduction in their symptoms. And I do want to encourage folks, if you, your family members, your friends have experienced an incident, to report it at Stop AAPI Hate. That's how we'll know and better understand what's happening. Your information is kept confidential. We don't release your name or any other identifying information. And so now I want to turn to this quote by Grace Lee Boggs, who was an amazing activist. What does it say? It says, "You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it." So I think this is a really important quote when we think about the program that you're in and how you can begin to make change. So these are a couple of photos of me as a child. Wanted to share a little bit about my own immigrant story, which is I came with my parents when I was a toddler. And, you know, as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965, which for the first time let in a lot of Asian Americans, we were actually banned from entry for many decades. And specifically, it created refugee and asylee programs. But for many Asian communities, it said you could come to the United States only if you had a certain professional background. If you were a doctor, if you were an engineer or a scientist. And so my parents both happened to be doctors. And so that's why they were allowed to come to the United States in a way that some of their relatives were not. That's also a picture of my grandparents, an aunt and uncle, some cousins, etc. So when I was growing up, though, you know, I had a happy childhood in Montgomery, Alabama, but I also was made aware of the fact very early on that I was not seen like all my classmates. That's a picture of my high school over there. And I had a teacher in 8th grade earth science who looked a little bit like this guy, Bryan Cranston. I think that might be from Breaking Bad. I'm not sure. And anyway, in our 8th grade class, he decided to play a Jeopardy game where he asked questions about earth science. I happened to get a lot of the questions right. And so another kid in the class asked the teacher out loud, you know, why is Manju getting all the answers? And his answer to the class was, she's not American. And that caused everyone to laugh at the joke. I don't know if they were also laughing at me, but you know, while I shook it off in the moment, thinking to myself, well, if being an American means being an idiot, count me out. It of course was really hurtful and painful. And it's part of that perpetual foreignness that caused my teacher to say that. Later, when I was in high school, it was in fact my favorite teacher in AP American History who said to me, or actually said to the class, to defend the Japanese incarceration, she said, if the United States were at war with India, should we intern Manju and one of my other Indian classmates? And 24 out of the 25 students, including a number of my white friends, chose to intern me. There was only one person in the whole class who didn't, who was my African-American friend. So that just really shows again the ways in which we are otherized, made to feel the perpetual foreigner, and then of course with the earlier example, also the model minority using that particular mythology. So also what happened when I was growing up is that my mother happened to apply for a job when I was in 5th grade at the local hospital. And when she did, she was interviewed by a panel of white male physicians. And really their only question for her was, why do foreigners like you come to the United States and take all of our jobs? You can imagine she was horrified by that question. They didn't, of course, hire her, but she and my dad chose to hire an attorney who was on the board of the Southern Poverty Law Center. They brought a class action lawsuit that not only got redress for my mother, but also changed the policies in the state of Alabama for doctors from non-European countries. And it was because of that that I actually decided to pursue a career in the law, seeing that it could address injustice against people of color. So my first job out of college actually was working at the Southern Poverty Law Center for the summer and working on a voting rights case, because at that time there were efforts to really limit the voting rights of African Americans. Now we see that really across the country, across many states and even local jurisdictions, there are efforts to take away the right to vote from people like you and me. Additionally, when I was at the ACLU my first summer, I worked on a case of Japanese Latin American redress. You may not know that in addition to 120,000 Japanese Americans, the United States government went to Latin America, to countries like Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, and kidnapped basically thousands of Japanese individuals who had lived there for 50 to 100 years. They were just like Americans here who really didn't have a connection with Japan, brought them to the United States and put them in incarceration camps, sometimes in their own camps, sometimes alongside Japanese Americans. And then after World War II, actually deported them to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if you can believe it. So I worked on that case. We were able to get them an apology from the US government for what happened. And unfortunately, while we couldn't get them 20,000 in reparations like Japanese Americans, we did get them $5,000. And so it was something to just show that this was an unjust policy by the American government. When I was then at MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, I worked on getting in-state tuition for undocumented students. Then I chose a pathway in health law and practiced health law, getting healthcare access for low-income individuals, especially those people of color. I also then worked at the South Asian Network, actually guiding that organization and working specifically in my own community, which I appreciated having the opportunity to do. We worked in the areas of healthcare access, of civil rights, and also violence prevention. And it was because of my work in the healthcare field that I actually got an award from President Obama. And you see a picture there at the White House. And then finally, I came to AAPI Equity Alliance. And this is a panel that we had early on with Congressman Ted Lieu, who represents part of Los Angeles, to talk about the impacts of the Trump presidency on Asian Americans. And I've continued to be at AAPI Equity Alliance since 2017. And so what I wanted to say as we sort of end this particular session is, you know, for me, it's not only been about those pieces of workplace activism, but also personal activism. So you see there at the bottom, This is a panoramic view of the Women's March in Washington, D.C. in 2017. I participated in it with my daughters, as well as some friends of ours and their daughters. So we were a big group of 8 to 10 people. And I love this particular sign from the march, which says, "When injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty." And that's really, to me, a motto for my life. And I've been able to use my understanding of the law and even challenging illegal or unconstitutional laws when they are brought forth. You see at the top there, that's actually during the pandemic, a picture of my husband and my 2 daughters as we participated in a Black Lives Matter rally near our home. And then finally, this one on the right, which is a Stop Asian Hate march in Koreatown in Los Angeles, and participating in that. And what was so heartening about that particular one is you saw people from all parts of the community. You saw amas and appas, nanis and nanas, titos and titas, all generations from 0 to 90, including even some folks in our community who are monolingual Chinese, Korean, Tagalog speakers, and some of them even in walkers and wheelchairs, but still coming out to say that what was happening against our communities would not and should not be tolerated. And you see from this particular slide, there have been many moments of that resistance and resilience in the face of the exclusion, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the incarceration, the civil rights movement. Actually, that's an iconic photo of Dr. Martin Luther King with at the Selma to Montgomery March with thousands of others. And what do you see there? They're all wearing leis. And that was a show of solidarity from Pastor Inouye, who came from Hawaii, to show that our communities support African-American communities. You may remember also, hopefully you learned in American history, that actually Dr. King got a lot of his ideas from the Indian independence movement, and learning specifically of nonviolence from Mahatma Gandhi. There's also, of course, the farm worker movement. Many folks have heard of Cesar Chavez, but haven't known about Larry Itliong, who actually helped to start the Filipino movement, and then it broadened, and within a few weeks, Cesar Chavez came on to that. So really acknowledging the contributions of our communities. We had post 9/11 organizing in the face of the racism our communities experienced, and of course, Asians for Black Lives, and more recently, the protest against anti-Asian hate. So that's this particular part of the session. I am now going to move to the other one. If you want to stretch for 15 to 30 seconds, feel free to do that, grab some water. And I'm going to move now to talk about our history in the United States. So I shared with you just now my origin story, as well as some of the work of Stop AAPI Hate. We're trying to do a number of different things, which include really providing holistic solutions to some of the problems in the civil rights arena with community safety. We also believe education equity is important, and we're striving to get ethnic studies in curriculum, K through 12 curriculum all across the country. And one of the things I then try to do in my webinars is to give you a crash course in Asian American and Pacific Islander history, because most of what I'm going to share with you today, I don't think you have necessarily learned in school, which is really unfortunate. As you may have heard the quote, those who don't know their history, are doomed to repeat it. And so we don't want to repeat the injustices that our community has experienced. So the first group of Asian migrants to the United States, of course, came before there was even a United States in 1587. So even before the Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock, before Jamestown, we know that Filipinos came to the US to California, the California region, Morro Bay, with Spanish traders. So on the West Coast. That was followed by, in later years, 1,000 plus individuals from South Asia being brought to the United States as coolies and
Manju,
workers.
Manju, do you want to show a different set of slides?
Well, I don't have a slide for that. Can you not see these slides?
No, we only see the original slides. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for telling me that. Okay, because I was running through. Let me undo them. Thank you for sharing that. 1 second. Okay. Sorry about that. I thought it should have moved directly to, but okay, let me share it again. There we go. Thank you, Helen. Appreciate that. So here we go. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Apologies for that error. But again, so the first group were the Filipino migrants who came in 1587. After that, as I mentioned, were the coolies who came to the French territories. And then, of course, we know that much happened in terms of the Revolutionary War. The United States became its own country, separate from England. And of course, there was the war with France, the French Indian War, etc. I want to move then to sort of more modern history. We know that the Civil War ended in 1865, and while slavery was abolished, we were beginning to then see the passing of segregation laws during the Reconstruction movement. So really undoing some of the success of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And those segregation laws actually impacted Asian American communities as well. Alongside that, we saw exclusionary immigration laws. Let me say first that if you were not a white man in the US, you were not allowed to naturalize. So for much of American history, it was only those people who were white who could become US citizens. The very first exclusionary law in the US was not the Chinese Exclusion Act, but the Page Act. A few years earlier, it prevented Chinese women from coming to the United States, labeling all of them as prostitutes. Really, really unfortunate, and I think gives you an idea of ideas around that perpetual foreignness and concocting ideas of Asians as unclean, unhygienic, bringing disease and bringing bad, immoral customs to the United States. We then had in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which after, of course, the Chinese Americans built the Transcontinental Railroad, they were essentially then thrown out, and new Chinese were not allowed into the United States. So you see here some pictures of really horrific cartoons that were in newspapers during that time. So one is of Uncle Sam holding the Chinese Exclusion Act, kicking out an individual who was Chinese. You see this other one that says the Chinese must go. So these kind of political cartoons were weaponized against our communities. Around that same time, we also saw the impacts of American imperialism in the Pacific Islands. And in 1893, the US government essentially helped local businessmen, American businessmen, overthrow Queen Liliuokalani, who was the monarch of Hawaii. And then soon after that, they annexed Hawaii as a US territory. And then in the 1900s, made it, I believe, the 50th state. Or was it the 49th? And then in 1885, a piece of good news. We had two Asian women come to the United States, and actually there's a picture of them graduate from the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania. So we were, even during that time, beginning to see some strides that were really important, and you know, especially for Asian American women. In 1896, there was the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which is in which the United States Supreme Court said segregation is legal, that separate but equal was fine, that it was just. So imagine that, for them to say that segregation is fine. And so that had tremendous impacts for another 50 to 60 years. And we'll talk about what undid that in a minute. Wong Kim Ark, I don't know if you've heard of him, but if any of you are citizens because you were born here in the United States, you can thank Wong Kim Ark. He brought a lawsuit, again, in front of the Supreme Court. He was born in the US. He traveled to China to visit family members. And when he came back, he was excluded because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he said, wait, I'm an American, I was born here. And so he took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, we do believe in birthright citizenship. Let me tell you that some politicians today want to get rid of that. They want to make it so that if you're born here, that you shouldn't get automatic citizenship just because you're born in the US. So really dangerous, exclusionary concept. Now, in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, it wasn't enough for America to want to exclude Chinese. In America, many individuals also wanted to exclude other immigrants, including South Asians. And so you may have heard of the term yellow peril. There was also the idea of the dusky peril, which is against individuals like me who were dark complected, who are brown, right? South Asians. And what's interesting here is they call it Hindu hordes, but actually most of these men in Washington, California, and Oregon were actually Sikh Americans. So they belong to the Sikh faith or tradition. That exclusionary league was successful in getting the Asiatic Barge Zone Act in 1917, which then forbade individuals from coming from most of Asia for about a 50-year period. Now, unfortunately, during this time, we also had something really horrific happen in a number of states, which is forced sterilizations against Latinx and African-American women. And you'll see here all of the states in which sterilization was used. So that is essentially to prevent women from having children. In fact, in Mississippi, there was a term called Mississippi appendectomy. An appendectomy is to take out your appendix, but what doctors would do is tell Black women that they needed an appendectomy when in fact they were sterilizing them against their will. These policies were actually praised by Adolf Hitler to say, look at America, that's what we need to be doing in Germany. So imagine that our policies were part of the vision of what one of the most horrific, evil individuals on our planet wanted to do. We were a model for that. In 1913, California and many other states, including Oregon and Washington, passed alien land laws, making it illegal for immigrants to own land. So they literally stole millions of dollars of property from Asian Americans that they rightfully purchased. So really horrific. And that was in fact even challenged and found to be legal. I mentioned the Asiatic Barge Zone Act. Part of what it said is that Asiatic people, it labeled us as being undesirable, and so not worthy of immigration to the U.S. I'm going to take a sip of water. So there were actually two cases regarding citizenship that involved Asian Americans. One was Bhagat Singh Thind, who served in World War II and was granted citizenship for that reason, but then had it taken away because of one of the Naturalization Acts. So he claimed that he should have been allowed citizenship because South Asians are Caucasian and therefore white. The Supreme Court said, well, Mr. Thind, you may be Caucasian, but common sense tells us you are not white. And so they literally took his citizenship away from him. We know that in 1932, there was a program to force Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants to leave the United States. In fact, it was part of a program called Operation Wetback. I apologize for using that term, but that's what the program was called. Of course, in 1942, we know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which then placed 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent in these concentration camps. Let me say that 60% of them were in fact US citizens at the time of their incarceration. So 60% were US citizens, and yet they were still incarcerated. At that same time, you'll remember that there was a lot of not only segregation and Jim Crow, but actually thousands of lynchings of Black men. And I show you that photograph there at the bottom. You can see two Black men hanging from a tree. Individuals in the South actually would have picnics and parties around lynchings. There's in fact a new book called Lynchings and Leisure about these parties that used to take place. Imagine that, how horrific. And these people are enjoying an evening out by watching a lynching, a killing of a Black man, and in this case two. You also see that there were different restrooms, segregated schools, of course, for African Americans versus white Americans. In 1946, we began to see the easing of some of those exclusionary laws. The Loose Seller Act, for the first time, allowed 100 individuals each, only 100 from India, 100 from the Philippines, to come to the United States, and allowed them to also be the ones that were still here to be naturalized. In 1947, Mexican American activists in the Menendez case were able to get an end to segregation of Mexican Americans in California and the Southwest. It was actually a lawsuit similar to Brown v. Board of Education, which we'll talk about in a minute. 1952, through another act, again, Asians and other non-white immigrants were allowed to become US citizens. So that's 1952. And then, as I mentioned, Brown v. Board of Education, this was a monumental case, right? Actually, a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court that segregation was unequal. They rejected and overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. Let me say that a number of the recent individuals added to the Supreme Court actually said they did not believe that Brown v. Board of Education was settled law. So that is a signal to us that they may be interested in overturning it, along with a lot of other laws that we hold sacred and dear. You see there again that iconic photo of the Selma to Montgomery March. You see other marches that happen throughout the country. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. At the Washington Civil Rights March, where millions of individuals came to claim what was their rightful position as equal citizens. And then you see a picture there of an Asian American young woman, a girl who was part of that march. And so again, just making clear that our communities were in solidarity. And let me say too, something that very few folks know, it is because of civil rights leaders that we got the Immigration Act of 1965. They could have rested on their laurels. They'd just gotten the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, but they said, no, our immigration laws are also very, very racist, because only Europeans were allowed to the United States in high numbers. So this law got rid of the country-based quotas, focusing instead on skills and family reunification. This is in fact the reason my family was able to come to the United States, and my mother was able to bring two of her sisters and their families through the reunification process. We know that in 1966, as I mentioned, there was the beginning of the farm worker movement. And here's a picture of Larry Itliong with Cesar Chavez working together to ensure justice for migrant farm workers, who of course pick all of our fruits and vegetables and really are the most essential workers in the United States. In 1967, the United States Supreme Court finally said that people of different races can legally marry. So for most of American history, it was illegal for people of color to marry a white person. They were what are called anti-miscegenation laws. So the case, which was called Loving v. Virginia, actually the name of the couple, an African-American woman and a white man, their surname was Loving, which is so appropriate for this case. Let me say too, the recent leaked decision by the Supreme Court indicates they may also overturn this decision as well, as noted by a number of legal scholars. During this period of the 60s, not only was there the civil rights movement, the women's movement, but we also had the Chicano student movement and the Asian American student movement. So at San Francisco State University, there were a number of Asian American young people who were crying out for peace against the Vietnam War, trying to claim their rightful place as part of the fabric of America. Fast forward to 1982, and this is really the time that we think of the modern Asian American movement, unfortunately because of a very tragic incident, and that is the brutal beating of Vincent Chen. He was mistaken by two unemployed auto workers as being Japanese American, when he was in fact Chinese American. They beat him the night before his wedding. He died of injuries 4 days later. And what's especially tragic about this case is the judge let the two individuals off with no jail time and only a minimal $3,000 fine. So basically saying that Vincent Chen's life wasn't worthy of more serious punishment, and he essentially didn't count. So many in our community protested that. As I said, it began the modern Asian American movement. Unfortunately, what we also saw though at the same time is the continued sort of use of the model minority mythology framing. You see there Asian American whiz kids suggesting that we are somehow different than all, other kids. And there's no evidence of that, right? No evidence whatsoever. And how this, otherizes us. You see also that picture of a young person at a spelling bee. And that same framing has been used, or against South Asians in terms of spelling bees. And they're winning spelling bees. Going then to 1992, we are now actually celebrating the 30th anniversary, or observing rather the 30th anniversary of the LA uprising. We don't call it the LA riots, but actually the uprising, or in Korean, it's known as Saegu, which took place following the Rodney King beating trial. So Rodney King, as you may know, was severely beaten by several police officers. As a result of that, there was a lawsuit brought by the Justice Department seeking to prosecute the police officers. The jury came back with a not guilty verdict for the officers. And so as a result of that, people were incensed across America, and especially Southern California. Sadly, the police chose not to be there to take action. And so there was looting, especially in Koreatown, that resulted in $1 billion worth of damage. But basically, they just chose not to show up. And so it was that injustice that led to the destruction. On a positive note, after that, African American and Korean communities really came together, a lot of local leaders, to say, we reject the wedge that's been created between us, and we're going to work together to make LA and our country a better place. Moving up a decade to 2001, you all are probably too young to know about 9/11. There was, of course, a terrorist attack in New York City. But in addition to that, there was also huge numbers of individuals of South Asian, Arab, Middle Eastern, and Sikh descent, Muslim and Sikh descent, who were beaten, who were killed, and really faced a tremendous backlash. In fact, the FBI reported in 2002 that violence against Muslims went up 1,600% in terms of hate incidents. And you'll see, just like with the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were a lot of political cartoons that were weaponized against our communities. Look at these three that show like all Muslims as terrorists seeking to kill Americans. Just really these horrific depictions of members of our community, the broader American community. And sadly, it wasn't just simply the interpersonal attacks, but also governmental programs. So there was a program called NSEERS, or Special Registration, which required Muslim men and boys who were originally from 26 countries, these were non-US citizens, to register just simply because of their religion. The last time we saw that was in Germany in the 1930s, when Jewish individuals had to register in Germany, preceding, of course, the Holocaust. 83,000 people did register. Several thousand, 13,000 were put in deportation proceedings because they resisted deportation. And can you guess how many terrorist attacks there were? Exactly 0. There were none that were found to come from just everyday members of the community. So programs like this that sought to profile and survey our communities, not only destructive, but ineffective. In 2006, there was an important case in the New York Court of Appeals that said that the stop and frisk policies of law enforcement are discriminatory and target African Americans. And this was a really important decision, really data-based in terms of showing what was happening against our communities and our African American sisters and brothers. If you can believe it, the NYPD that was much hailed after 9/11 for saving lives actually released a horrible report about Muslim Americans called the Radicalization of the West, saying that they needed to mobilize against thousands of Muslims that live in New York City. Within 10 years of 9/11, the number of white supremacist and hate groups grew by 70%. After 2016, that number grew again. We're now talking of over 1,600 white supremacist groups. Sadly, a number of them were given a red carpet treatment and allowed in the White House under the previous regime. In 2012, Wade Michael Page was a white supremacist who opened fire at a Sikh Gurudwara, killing 6 individuals when they were just simply praying on a Sunday afternoon in August. And that hate continued against South Asian, Sikhs, and Muslims for a decade, really until 2020, we began to see, you see Srinivas Kuchibhotla there, a picture with his wife. He was at a bar in Kansas, and with his friend, a white man came in and said, "Go back to your country," shot and killed him for no reason, shot his friend who thankfully survived. There were numerous arson attacks against mosques. Sikh individuals continued and continue even now to be attacked when they're working at their convenience stores as taxi drivers. There were some recent attacks in New York City against 2 different Sikh male individuals. And then this picture is 3 individuals who were shot. They were students at University of North Carolina by their neighbor. They were shot and killed. Media tried to claim it was because of a parking spot, when in fact the neighbor was involved in white supremacist activities and made clear that he was anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. And then finally, fast forward to 2021, where 6 Asian women were killed at 3 different salons in Atlanta. Richard Long, a white individual who had frequented those salons. He knew exactly what he was doing when he went to them. It was across 30 miles. And he specifically targeted salons that had Asian or in the title of their salons. And even, the day after, a police officer really tried to act as his defense attorney, saying, Richard just said he had a bad day. He was trying to get rid of his sex addiction. He says he's not racist. As if we're supposed to take at face value an individual who has engaged in hate crimes. Excuse me. Even Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, excuse me, after this incident said it may not be a hate crime, with little or no evidence. So finally, I want to end on a positive note, which is that in the last 2 years, thousands of individuals across the country have really protested against hate. They've become activated. You saw one of the photos of the Koreatown rally. We've seen that on social media. We at Stop AAPI Hate have gotten a lot of positive feedback from folks. And in fact, that is now taking the form of action, right? So we have people who are activated, and now we're seeing legislation all across the country. We have 3 bills in the California legislature to address racism against our communities. We know a number of states are passing ethnic studies in their schools. And so we really encourage you all to take on that mantle as the next generation of activists. You're our future leaders, and I pass on that baton to all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend.